we want to understand the unique selection pressures that then gave rise to these differing groups of plants. So we talked last time, within the caryophytes, we find some extant plants that then share the common ancestor, also the embryophytes. We talked about Coleoptera and some of these other green algae taxa that had then a set of traits associated with retaining fertilized eggs. Okay. And keeping the fertilized eggs close to mom for just a little bit. So some of these early traits associated with the evolution of the land plants turns out to be parental care, increasing the survivorship of the developing zygote by holding them, these little ones, closer to mom. So this Coleoptera-like ancestor had traits associated with retention of fertilized eggs, a little bit of parental care. And that turns out to be very important for life on land, successful reproduction on land. All right, now, when we think of the embryophytes, what is the key synapomorphy of all the embryophytes? All the land plants share one thing in common. Yes, in the corner. No. The archegonium, but not bad. You're kind of close. Okay. It's the archegonium. All land plants share this one trait. An archegonium. An archegonium is a multicellular structure that retains the developing zygote within mom. Okay. Just like a mammal. Right? Mammals retain the developing zygote inside mom. Very similar. Selection then for increased survivorship and of the developing zygote. The archegonium, a key structure. It's the key structure that defines all of the land plants. Okay? Archegonium. All right, so we talked about these cool plants. Bryophytes are awesome. If you get a chance to go out to some really cooler, wetter places, you can find a lot of these bryophytes, and they're awesome because they retain a lot of the traits associated with the early land plants. I'm showing you a heat map here for liverworts. Now, liverworts, a group of plants in the bryophytes. Okay, and so you tend to find them today. This is we tend to find. This is the number of species, by the way. Number of species. Look at hundreds of species of liverworts. Oh my gosh, these guys are really cool. They're kind of like green and slimy, and just like little. Sometimes they get a little bit bigger. They have these leaf-like extensions. Don't call them leaves. They're not true leaves, but they have these leafy structures. They go to these cool, high cloud forests, a lot of water. Nice and cool. You find these around the forest floor, up on the barks of trees, in the branches. Find a lot of them. In the Northeast, Pacific Northwest, wet areas, you tend to find liverworts. Wet. Okay. Now, did you go over this life cycle? Yes. How boring life cycles are. Oh my gosh. When I took botany, they got hammered these things into our heads because they're so boring. But they're beautiful. They're beautiful because it is a cycle. So remember, all living organisms have to complete their life cycle in order to survive, but also to reproduce. Right? So a life cycle is a manifestation of survivorship and reproduction. So the green algae. Here is a generic life cycle for a liverwort. So within the liverwort itself, in this green and a leafy extension here, you also find these little tube-like structures. They're called archegonia. And within the archegonia, what you actually find is the developing zygote. Okay? So these are very small. These are relatively minute. Within each archegonium, that we find then the developing zygote. The archegonium on the structure is haploid. But as soon as we get fertilization, we get a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote then undergoes cell division, mitosis, and this developing zygote becomes multicellular, diploid, growing within this haploid structure. So that as then this developing diploid structure then grows within the haploid structure, what is that diploid part of the life cycle called? Anyone remember? The sporophyte. The diploid part of the life cycle, in the light green here, is the sporophyte. The sporophyte is growing within the, what's the other part of the life cycle? Not the sporophyte, but the gametophyte. Okay? Plants alternate between sporophyte and gametophyte. Gametophyte and sporophyte. Gametophyte and sporophyte, sporophyte and gametophyte. It's happening all the time. Haploid, diploid, haploid, diploid. So most of the structure here in this liverwort, including this green slimy leaves that you see, this is all gametophyte. It's all haploid. Isn't that bizarre? Alternating between haploid and diploid. Within the sporophyte produces spores. Now don't get confused here because we're talking about spores, but then also sperm and egg. Sporophyte produces spores. What kind of cellular division occurs within the sporophyte to produce spores? Meiosis, not mitosis, but meiosis. Meiosis takes a diploid cell, reduces it to produce haploid spores. Okay? Haploid spores are then shed freely in the environment, in the wind. They land, undergo cell division. What kind of cell division is these developing spores doing? What kind of cell division? Mitosis, very good. Mitosis, we have a growing gametophyte via mitosis. Generate these elaborate leafy structures. On these leafy structures, we start producing these tubes. These nice tubes, sort of these nice tubes called archegonium and antheridium. Antheridium produces sperm, archegonium contains eggs. Antheridium is the male component, archegonium is the female. So we have a leafy structure that's producing antheridium, which produces sperm, and a leafy structure producing archegonium, which is producing an egg. How does sperm get to the egg? It swims. And there's your vital clue. The most fundamental constraint associated with the early land plants, that sperm has to swim. Where do you find liverworts? What environment? What kind of environment do you find liverworts? Wet. Wet, because sperm have to swim in order to then get fertilization. Once you get fertilization, you get the sporophyte. Okay. It's as simple as that. Right? Yes.
Why it is the cool environment?
Cool environment because water doesn't evaporate as fast, right? Cool and wet. There's a lot of water most of the time. Now these guys are really small, tend to be on the forest floor, right? Where it tends to be wet, a little muddy. And the places we go and work where we can find liverworts, you have to wear boots and all that stuff. Rain jacket gets wet. Okay. That's a liverwort. Okay. you should be able to draw an approximate life cycle of the liverwort. Approximate. It's just like the life cycle of a green algae, but a little different. Okay. So remember, all of this green stuff that you can see of a liverwort, that's all the gametophyte. But within the gametophyte, out pops the sporophyte. Isn't that weird? In one individual, you have this gametophyte, which is haploid. And then the process of the life cycle, you get the developing sporophyte, which is diploid. Totally bizarre. Plants are aliens. Within then the sporophyte, see the production of spores at the end. In a structure known as the sporangium. We'll come back. We have the gametophyte, the developing sporophyte, and at the top we have the structures known as sporangium, where we produce spores. Spores are haploid, the gametophyte is haploid, but the sporophyte itself is diploid. Okay. So bryophytes, wet, cool environments, liverworts, mosses, all that green stuff, all you see is gametophyte. Okay. But if you look really close, you tend to see the sporophyte. Okay, so here's mosses. Here's where you tend to find mosses. Heat map a number of species. So the redder it is, the more species of moss. There's like kind of liverworts. They're in humid, kind of wet, cool environments. Okay? Because sperm need to swim. So a little bit of review. We have leaves. These are not true leaves. These are leaves in quotations. Leafy structures, leaf-like structures. Not true leaves. I'm going to tell you what a true leaf is. These are imitation leaves. These are cheap-made leaf-like structures. We don't quite have roots yet, but we have structures known as rhizoids that start to kind of function like roots. We haven't talked about roots yet. Okay? These are basically specialized branches then that kind of help with nutrient uptake a little bit. We're going to be talking about that. So leaf-like structures, root-like structures, and then these structures at the top here. Don't worry, they're called seta. I don't really care so much about the naming of this. This is part of the sporophyte. This is the structure that then emerges and from the gametophyte to produce then the sporangium for spores and then release. Moss anatomy. How fun. Okay. They're so cute. Oh my gosh, you got to go out and check out some moss in the cool weather. Again, all you see is gametophyte. Here's a bunch of different mosses. You can see these little sporophytes kind of growing out, right? Now notice in mosses that the sporophyte is becoming more dominant, okay? A larger part of the life cycle. So you can begin to notice them then a little bit. Ah, another gosh darn life cycle. Here we go. Notice life cycle. Gametophyte, sporophyte, gametophyte, sporophyte, haploid, diploid. Within then the gametophyte itself, we can see an archegonia, key structure. Inside the archegonium is an egg. We also find structures known as antheridia. Antheridia then are these tube-like structures producing then sperm. Sperm is produced in the antheridium. Eggs are produced in the archegonium. In order for sperm to come into contact with egg, they have to swim. That's why we need water. Water has to be present. So remember these land plants, it's like they still can't break free of the water. Okay, they're still tied to water. Remember, when green algae, as green algae are bathed in water all the time, it's no problem. Water is available all the time for sperm to swim. Now, in these early land plants, they're still tied to water. They haven't quite broken free of water because of this reproductive constraint. Once we have a fertilization event, the zygotes, two haploid gametes, sperm and egg, combine them to get a diploid zygote. Diploid zygote then undergoes cell division. What kind of cell division is occurring within the zygote? Mitosis. Very good. We get mitosis, we get cell division, and the embryo, diploid embryo, starts growing in size. Becoming larger and larger, all because of mitosis. It basically emerges out of the gametophyte. Really cool. At the top of the gametophyte, we then have these sporangia produced, where what type of cell division is occurring within the diploid sporophyte to produce spores? Meiosis. We're now taking the diploid cell, reducing it to haploid cells, where we have spores being produced. Those spores are dispersed on the wind, land, and undergo cell division. What type of cell division? Mitosis. Very good. Grow the gametophyte. Now we produce Antheridian archegonia. Sperm and egg. Fertilization. Bingo. Diploid. We grow the sporophyte. It's the same thing over and over. But now what's happening is that as plants have a foothold in the land, natural selection is starting to act on them in terms of acting on survivorship and or reproduction for life on land. Okay, so aspects of the life cycle are going to be selected for on land. It's always fun. You can watch these time-lapse photography. There's a gazillion of these on YouTube. No, not really. You have to kind of search for these. But you can find these developing sporophytes, all powered by mitosis. Pretty fun. You see the sporangia up on top. Meiosis is occurring within them, releasing them, these spores, into the environment. How fun. Okay. Adaptations for the invasion of the land. Okay. So, what are the key traits? This is a rhetorical question. I want to ask you, what are the key traits associated with life on land? What attributes or what traits were selected for in order then for plants then to live on the land? Okay. Yeah, so we went over archegonia was key. Okay. Now that's just a structure or trait. Okay. It doesn't really tell you much about the process of evolution by natural selection. What other aspects that other traits that these early land plants have in order then to increase their viability on land? Anything else? Anything comes to mind? Any guess? All right, let's try to fill it in. I want you to think of this as having to do with traits either associated with survival. Okay? So in order to live on land, you have to survive on land. You have to actually exist, right? You have to be under the sun, under these dry conditions, right? So you have to obtain resources, for one. Okay? And in general, it looks as if you have to be kind of big to do that on land. You can't be unicellular so much. You have to be kind of bigger. Okay? So multicellularity was key. But also, you have to avoid desiccation. Remember, once you poke your little leaf, okay, out of the water, right, it's easy to desiccate. You have to avoid desiccation. Okay? But there's other traits too. Okay? And I want you to start thinking of this because I'll probably ask you more of a synthetic question associated with what are the key traits associated with survival. But it's not just surviving. You have to reproduce. So it's good to be able to survive on land, but you're not going to stick around for long in terms of multi-generations if you can't reproduce on land. Okay? So remember, fitness is a combination of survivorship and reproduction. Okay? So reproduction is key. So you guys immediately zeroed in on a key trait, archegonia. This is a trait associated with successful reproduction. Okay, so reproducing is good, but you also have to survive. Okay? So also think about the traits associated with survivorship. All right, archegonia, antheridium. There's a few others. Okay, another key trait, something called sporopolymer, which is really important, it turns out, because you can look at the biomolecular signal of sporopolymer in rocks. And you can do chemical analyses of rocks. And leading up to about 500 million to 400 million years ago, we see no evidence of at all of unique chemical signature of sporopolymer until we get to the time of the land plants, where we see a spike of the chemical signature associated with sporopolymer. And so we can date with certainty the arrival of the land plants. All right. Why do we focus on traits related to survivorship and reproduction? I already told you, but I want to emphasize this. Why survivorship and reproduction? Because, Brian, survivorship and reproduction defines what? Thank you. Oh my goodness. Oh, exhausting up here. Sporopolymer. Really unique, very complicated structure, but it turns out the sporopolymer is what covers and coats spores. Okay? And in particular, sporopolymer appears to be associated with some of these earliest land plants. Kind of acts like a cuticle. It's this waterproof substance that basically keeps these developing gametophytes from desiccating. Okay. So it covers them with spores so that the spores don't desiccate. And then once we're in a wet area, the developing gametophyte then reveal itself and pop out of the spore coat. So it helps maintain viable spores that can live a long time. So it also turns out that sporopolymer also is a critical substance that helps pollen grains. We haven't talked about pollen yet. Pollen is not spores. Pollen is something related but a little different. But pollen also is covered in sporopolymer, hence the name. Okay, so let's walk ourselves up. These key synapomorphies of the basal land plants. Now, bryophytes, bastophytes, embryophytes. Once we get to the land plants here, within this group of plants associated with hornworts, mosses, tracheophytes, right? We see another key synapomorphy, something known as a stomate. A stomate, or plural, stomata. Stomata are little puncture wounds, little pores that can be open and closed that allows for coordinated gas exchange. CO2 in and water out. A way to regulate water loss and CO2 uptake. A trait associated with desiccation and the ability to control the exchange of CO2 and water. We're going to learn more about stomates. A key trait associated with survivorship. Surviving on land required avoiding desiccation. Stomates help you control water loss and desiccation. A key trait. We're going to learn more about stomates a little bit. But hornworts, mosses, tracheophytes characterized by stomata. Stomates. Liverworts. You see stomates and liverworts. Poor little guys desiccate really quickly. Once we get to the common ancestor, probably the mosses and the tracheophyte, we start seeing traits associated with elaboration of the sporophyte, indeterminate growth of the sporophyte. So, re-analogy, liverworts, hornworts, most of the life cycle is in the gametophyte. By the time we get to some of the mosses, but in particular the tracheophytes, the dominant form of the life cycle is the sporophyte. Finally, once you get to the tracheophytes, the key trait is associated with the vascular system, the vascular tissue, conducting for water and also for sap. We'll talk more about tracheophytes in a little bit. Like maybe right now, okay? Tracheophytes. Gosh, some of these plants you've heard about. Ferns, sea plants. Yay, we like sea plants. Other crazy things. Horsetails. Oh my gosh, the lycopods. I have to just kind of stop and I get a little misty-eyed when I think about the lycopods. It's a sad story. Lycopods are awesome. They used to dominate the world. But now, there's a few remnant species. Ancient storytellers of this incredible dynasty of the lycopods. Lycopods are cool because there's a whole separate line of plant evolution that went on in the past. Most of these things are extinct. And in that separate line of plant evolution, a lot of their traits evolved very similar to the dominant form of plants that we see today, the seed plants. It's this cool story of two separate major lines of plant evolution, where we see independent evolution of many different traits in each one of those. But then one of them died out, left the dominant seed. I'll tell you the sad story of the lycopods as we go on. Oh, and we get to my favorite word. We haven't gotten my favorite word yet, but we will. Hey, liverworts, mosses, hornworts. We've learned some of these guys, the bryophytes. Now we're going to start delving into tracheophytes. Okay? The vascular plants, club mosses, horsetails, ferns, and the seed plants. We'll have more time to talk about them as we kind of come up here. Let's kind of zoom in on a few of them. Oh my gosh, the lycopods. So fun. These guys are cute. Look at them. You can find lycopods in the Sonoran Desert. So cool. Resurrection plant. Resurrection plant. This is this really cool plant. The lycopod. It looks dead, but when the rains come, it greens up like immediately. Like it's one of these cases of basically dehydrate yourself. Look like you're dead. Stick around for maybe hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. If you wet it, you come back to life. People are trying to study some of these lycopods to figure out, could you actually dehydrate a person or an animal and resurrect them? Resurrection plants are pretty cool. So all you see here is sporophyte. This is all sporophyte. In fact, it's really difficult to find a demetophyte. Demetophyte is very, very rare, but it's out there. Horsetails. Gosh, these guys are really cool. Used to be incredibly dominant. Okay? All you see is sporophyte. Demetophyte is out there. It's very small, which means that we still need water for fertilization. And you can see then these sporangia at the top producing these spores. Ferns. Oh my gosh, you guys know ferns, right? Very common. Okay. Ferns are awesome. Tree ferns. Tropical cloud forest, okay, lowland tropical forest that is especially wet. Sometimes you get these incredible tree ferns. Go up on Mount Lemmon, the understory, wonderful forest up there, filled with ferns. Flip over the backside of this fern leaf, okay, what you actually see are these little tiny brown spots. This is a fern, in structure they're called sori. These are sporangia, producing spores. And still producing spores. Ferns are wonderful. And then we get to the seed plants. Okay, these are the major groupings of the vascular plants. Lycopods, equisetum, or the horsetails, ferns, and then the seed plants. You guys know seed plants, right? Saguaros, nice maple trees, conifer trees, anything with flowers, right? Gymnosperms or angiosperms. So the angiosperms are the flowering plants. And the non-flowering plants here, the conifers, or the gymnosperms. Okay. All right, so what are unique selection pressures on land? I'm going to emphasize this a few times, but let's see if we can list them out. Okay. What are the unique selection pressures on land? There you go. Name something that comes to mind. Something. Having to reproduce increasingly outside of water. Yeah, okay. Good. What else? How about you, right behind her?
Controlling water loss.
Controlling water loss. Okay, excellent. Associated with desiccation. All right, I like that. What else? What else associated with survivorship? Surviving. Nutrients are hard to get. All right, so we haven't quite gotten there yet, but that's coming up. It's associated with the evolution of the vascular plants. Okay, maybe what we can do is we can maybe morph that answer into maybe transporting resources, transporting nutrients. Okay. What else about the unique selective pressures on land? Let's think maybe more reproduction. Okay, so we talked about then the gametophyte. But think of yourself, you're kind of growing up, you're kind of sessile, you're stuck to this one place. Your spores have to go somewhere. Right?
Your spores up.
Dispersal.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe you want to, instead of just kind of dispersing things nearby where you already are, maybe you want to try to find some location where you're developing, hopefully, offspring somewhere else. Find them a good spot, right? All right. Anything else? Any other ideas?
But things like insects, other creatures.
Did you just mention an animal?
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Birds.
What about animals? They're not around yet, right? They're not on land yet. But soon they will be on land, right? Now, not necessarily insects, but the main quote unquote predator, the thing that you have to worry about, things like microbes, okay, bacteria, and fungi are also around. Okay. So we don't have animals yet. Okay. But they're undergoing their own unique selective pressures too. Okay, and soon they will be on the land. Okay. So we're not dealing with aspects of coevolution with animals yet. Okay, but keep that thought. Okay, it's really good. All right. So selection for traits that increase survivorship and reproduction in dry environments. In dry environments. So increasing colonization of the land. And early on, these wet areas were colonized really quickly. But there's this whole landscape that was increasingly drier and drier and drier that had the potential to be colonized. So if you had the traits that enabled you to colonize and survive on more dry parts of the land, it was an open frontier. So the first land plants got a foothold in these really wet areas. And very quickly, it became crowded. Right? Because everyone was doing it. Filled up all the space. But just move your little rhizoids just a little bit further, all this open space, in this drier environment that had no competition. So increasing colonization of the land, increasingly more dry and harsh environment, very strong selection for traits that increases survivorship and reproduction in drier and drier environments. Now, from the life cycle, there is a critical part of the life cycle that's tied to water. And what is that part of the life cycle? Remember the life cycle, gametophyte, sporophyte, there's a key part of that life cycle that's critically tied to water. And what is that? The back. Anybody in the back? What part of the life cycle is critically tied to water? You need water. Well, something associated with the sporophyte, ultimately, and into the gametophytes, yeah? What has to swim? Sperm have to swim, period. Okay? Now I'm going to fast forward into the flowering plants. All right, plants with flowers. We actually don't talk about sperm, and we don't talk about swimming. They got rid of it. They broke free, finally. And once they did that, they colonized the rest of the land. Amazing. But how did they do that? How do you get rid of the need for sperm to swim? Okay. Key constraint. Okay. Increasing colonization of the lands, the available area for plants is limited. Once you have a trait that enables you to fill up all the space, everyone's going to do it. So the competition becomes really intense. The competition was increasingly important because all of these wet areas got filled in. Right? Increasing competitive pressure for other land plants, so that if you had a trait that enables you then to survive and reproduce in drier areas, that would be selected for because it's an open frontier. So selection will act to increase survivorship and reproductive success in increasingly drier environments because most land is totally empty. There's nothing growing up. So cool. We have really good fossil reconstructions of what these early environments look like. So early land plants colonize these really wet interfaces between the land and the water. And very quickly, these all got filled up with several different species of plants. Look at these cool Cooksonia. Oh my gosh, the Zostrophyllophytes. My favorite word. Okay, within the Devonian, okay, we start to see all these crazy looking plants. Okay, at this interface between the land and the water. Let's remind ourselves where we are in the grand scheme of things. Coming out of the Ordovician into the Silurian, see many lines of evidence of the first fossils of the land plants. Okay, approximately 4 to 440 million years ago. That's when the terrestrial environment was amongst the first to be invaded, land plants, around 400 million years ago. And so we know this based on many bits of evidence. All right, so that's basically when everything began. As we move forward into the Devonian, all of the action happens in the Devonian. Basically, you can learn about 95% of all botany by what happens in the Devonian. Everything else is pretty boring until you get to the flowering plants. Then it kind of picked up a little bit. Okay? But crazy stuff happened in the Devonian really quickly. Okay? So Silurian into the Devonian. All the action happened in the Devonian. Crazy traits evolved in the Devonian, and it happened really fast. Between 409 and 363 million years ago. Gosh, we live in Arizona. What an awesome state this is, because you can see it all. It's right here. We can see when all of this happened, and we can pull out all the fossils and understand the timeline. Just have to go to the Grand Canyon. So you then go down through all these various layers. Once you get to the Bright Angel Shale down low, 550 million years ago, and moved them through all of these sedimentary rocks in the story of the land plants. Ordovician into the Silurian, into the Devonian. In the Ordovician, we start to see multicellular fossils, multicellular plants with cuticles. Remember, a cuticle then prevents desiccation. Cuticle is a waxy then substance producing that desiccation. We also start to see during the Silurian stomates and water conducting cells. By the time we get the Devonian, we see the first recognizable land plant lineage, and where we have entire fossils. The trachea plant. Okay. We see then early plants associated then with the common ancestor, then a very bryophyte-looking ancestor, and once we get the Devonian, start to see fossils that look like tracheophytes. Next time, I'll tell you my fossil story about Cooksonia. It's an awesome fossil. I get to hold one. Cooksonia. Cool early plant. Doesn't really look like much. And here it is. It turns out it's really small. It's like this big. All you see is sporophyte. Unique branching. We call this dichotomous branching. Right? You have parent, daughter branches become a parent, they produce daughter branches, right? Branch with nodes, all that dichotomous branching. Sporangia, these structures at the top, they produce spores. So this is all the sporophyte, all diploid, producing these spores at the top, releasing these sporangia, right? And the spores then fall. No leaves. But they have stomates on the little stems, green photosynthetic stems. And if you cut these open, you actually find these specialized water conducting cells, which are the telltale signs of a tracheophyte. Okay? Cooksonia, a very famous, one of the first well-recognizable early land plants, a tracheophyte. Ordovician, Silurian into the Devonian. Okay? Geologic time chart. Land plants originated around 400 million years ago. Have even fossil Archegonian during this time. Now these shaded areas, these represent basically kind of the magnitude of the amount of plants than present than on the Earth at these different times. So as you go from the Devonian into these later geologic time periods, what we actually start to see are several major lineages developing. Let me come back to this diagram. Okay. So we're really focused right here. This beginning before this huge radiation and explosion of different species, all these major taxa. Okay? Bryophytes, lycopods, seed plants into the angiosperms, the flowering plants, which are really late to the game. Right? Most of the Earth history of plants didn't contain flowering plants. Flowering plants took over relatively recently. Okay. What's interesting is that this early part of land plant evolution, we see a big split. Radiation in kind of two different directions. Early plants are known as rhiniophytes, okay? Named after this region in Germany where they found these early plant fossils. But then we get this whole other group of plants called the Zostrophyllophytes. My favorite word. Zostrophyllophytes. And then we get another group of plants known as the Tramerophytes. These are differing evolutionary lineages that have their own unique evolutionary history, but ultimately trace back to the rhinophytes, early land plants. So immediately into the Devonian, we see two major lineages. And this is associated with the sad story of the lycophytes. The Zostrophyllophytes, the Trimerophytes. This all occurs during the Devonian. And the descendants of the Zostrophyllophytes, the Trimerophytes, gave rise to this incredible diversity of land plants we see today. All right, now let's simplify this. So what we see, if we zoom back, the early selection pressures for life on land, we see two differing evolutionary routes. Right? On the one hand, natural selection started to amplify the size of the gametophyte, the bryophytes. Okay? Now, there was another group of plants where natural selection increased the size of its sporophyte, the tracheophytes, the vascular plants. Okay? Now, ultimately, tracheophytes took over the world, whereas the bryophytes strongly restricted to regions with water. Okay? Because sperms swim, but within the tracheophytes, you see additional selection, mainly having to do with life in drier and drier environments. So we can kind of piece together what we know from our various different fossils. Hypothetical first embryophyte, we have this, gosh, basically this bryophyte-looking structure, the green, leafy, multicellular environment, and we have this archegonium kind of sticking up, and then within the archegonium, we get fertilization, and we then develop the diploid sporophyte, right? So we have gametophyte and sporophyte. And so that was kind of like what we can find in the early fossil records. So within the tracheophytes reflect selection to elaborate the sporophyte, so that the sporophyte side of the life cycle becomes elaborated, much bigger, and the gametophyte is highly reduced. Whereas in the bryophytes, the gametophyte over evolutionary time was elaborated. So bigger and bigger gametophyte, and the sporophyte is relatively small. Two separate ways which natural selection kind of explored this early life on land. Again, this is all about life cycles. We started with the green algae, right? Now, let's get up and add one more life cycle. See, I had to sneak in another life cycle today, okay? What about a fern? Oh my gosh, all you see is sporophyte. Hear that? Well, hold on. Yeah. These are trees. They're ferns, okay? Ferns, look at all the ferns, right? All these ferns, all you see is sporophyte. But if you look, if you go out, especially when it's wet, you can find them. Gametophytes, fern gametophytes, they're small. Penny or pence, okay, just for scale. Here's a fern gametophyte. Sometimes you find the antheridium, the archegonium, multicellular. Okay, you have these little rhizoids too to help them kind of anchor and obtain a little bit of resources. You can find them on the forest floor. They're really small. Okay? Cute. But they're pretty rare. All right, let's do a life cycle of a fern. Same thing. Gametophyte, sporophyte. Most of what you see in a fern is sporophyte. Okay? The leaf-like structure, that's all sporophyte. If you look on the underside of the fern, you'll see these reproductive structures. They're called sori. Don't worry about the term, but know that this is where you produce spores. They're sporangia. On the backside of the fern, spores are then produced. Spores are haploid. Right? Spores are haploid. We go then from a diploid structure known as a sporophyte into these reproductive structures where we're creating then spores via meiosis. Right? Meiosis takes diploid cells, creates haploid cells or spores. The spores are then shed into the environment. They land. We undergo cell division, mitosis. Via mitosis, we create this haploid structure known as the gametophyte again. On the gametophyte, we have archegonium and antheridium. Archegonium has eggs, antheridium has sperm, right? Same thing. Same thing as a green algae. Antheridium, we're producing them sperm, they have to swim, fertilize the egg in the archegonium. Bingo, we have a diploid zygote. We undergo mitosis, cell division, and grow the sporophyte inside the gametophyte. Same life cycle. Okay? So this example shows one size spores. Now, if we go back during the Devonian, what we start to see are spores at different size. Sometimes we see this in the fossil record. So instead of having one size spore, some of these spores are really big. Some of the spores are really small. Why do we see these differences in spore sizes? Why have a big spore? Why have a small spore? Anybody? Remember, this is a haploid cell, a spore, right? Why do we start to see some spores that are big and some spores that are small? Think about these selective questions. Why would you think? Yes. A larger spore could get resources easier. A larger spore also reflects more investment in that spore. You have more resources, maybe. Kind of like a seed. Right? Whereas if they have a small spore, you don't have as many resources. Why would you want to be a small spore? Why would selection sometimes favor a small spore? Higher dispersal rates. Smaller things can travel further, right? They keep up on the wind. So during this time in the Devonian, we start to see spores of differing sizes. And that's a key set of innovations. What's going to come next? So, reproductive role of the sporophyte, produce and disseminate spores. Now, technically, we call these spores myospores. Myospores are spores produced from meiosis. Now, we utilize wind as the abiotic vector for the dispersal of spores. There's no pollination now. There's no insects. There's no animals. The only way plants can move around on the planet is via wind. Okay? Wind was the only dispersal vector. On land, we see increased selection for increased reproductive roles of the sporophyte. Spores are shed and dispersed via wind. Colonization of all sites are aided then by small spores. Right. Boundary layers. Let's do just a little bit of hydrodynamics and physics. How many people know what a boundary layer is? Oh my gosh. All right, you kind of know what it is, right? You go out on the lawn on the student union there, and it's a windy day. And if you start laying, if you take a seat on the lawn and then you lay down on the lawn, is it going to be more windy when you're laying down on the lawn or when you're standing up? When you're standing up, it's more windy, right? Why is that? Gosh, you're just like a sporophyte sticking your head up, right? It's because of something known as a boundary layer. Okay? When we be talking about boundary layers, having to do gas exchange and photosynthesis, but it turns out boundary layers are really critical because, especially if you're really small and near the surface, your life is governed by the boundary layer. Wind, actually, it's fluid dynamics. This could be water. Wind is moving, but near the surface, friction is slowing down the flow of that fluid or air. Okay, the surface is providing a friction that slows then the speed of the wind of the fluid. Okay, and because of which, as you move away from the surface, that friction force is no longer an important factor, and we start to see the true velocity emerge. This region where the velocity is slowed down because of friction is known as the boundary layer. And it's really critical. And it shaped life on Earth. because early plants grew on a surface were very small. Their life was well inside the boundary layer. But as natural selection selected for individuals to poke their head a little bit higher, something magical happened. You could escape the boundary layer, meaning your sporophyte with spores could access increased wind velocities, which would disperse your spores further. Imagine two individuals, one that poked its little sporophyte only to here, and another individual that poked its sporophyte up to here. If we're competing for the same space, and our offspring are all going to land either nearby or further away, my offspring, if I'm a little taller, could disperse and find that distant, uncolonized spot more easily than somebody living close to the boundary line. Okay. Spores, critical, important factor. Imagine ambient wind speed versus height. As you then move up in height, right? All of a sudden you'll find this critical point where the wind velocity increases dramatically. Right? It's on the scale about the size of a moss. All right, in general. So the little sporophytes are sticking well into and above the boundary layer. Okay. As we go from green algae, mosses, equistetum, okay, we get into the ferns, and then ultimately, once we get into the flowering plants, we're not quite there yet. The relative size of the gametophyte relative to the sporophyte is changing. So by the time we get to the flowering plants, and we're not there yet, the gametophyte is so reduced, you can't even recognize it. But you can see its remnants. Once we get to the flowering plants, it's all sporophyte, and the gametophyte has been reduced almost nothing, but it's still there. All right. Synapomorphies. Land plants. There are bryophytes. There are tracheophytes. We started to fill in the tracheophytes. Club mosses, horsetails, ferns, and steep plants. We have an archegonia, the key synapomorphy of the land plants. This common ancestor had the trait of an archegonia, which is passed on to all the descendants. This individual also had a cuticle, which is also a key trait that enabled survivorship then on land. We have a key trait associated with reproduction on land, archegonia, and a key trait associated with survivorship, cuticle, to prevent desiccation. Pretty quickly, we see them an individual that had not only archegonia and a cuticle, but all of a sudden had stomates. Stomates help reduce water loss and regulate water loss and CO2 uptake. Again, helping to survive on land. That individual then left behind descendants in the hornworts and everything else, okay, where we have stomates. Pretty soon, we see selection for something known as a trachea. Okay, tracheids are a key trait associated then with the tracheophytes. The tracheid is the synapomorphy that defines the tracheophytes. The tracheid is the synapomorphy that defines the tracheophytes. All right, so I'll just kind of end with emphasizing these four central functions of a typical land plant. These are kind of the major functions: reproduction, hydraulics, transporting and absorbing resources, photosynthesis, but also mechanics. That is, you have to actually stand up and be able to perform your duties, all right, when the time is right. So reproduction, hydraulics, photosynthesis, and mechanics. We haven't talked much about biomechanics, but we're going to do that in just a little bit. A lot of emphasis on reproduction. We haven't so much spoken about hydraulics, but we're getting to that point. And also photosynthesis. But all plants basically have to maintain these four functions in order to be viable. And so hydraulics, mechanics, and photosynthesis all associated with survivorship. And of course, reproduction is important for, obviously, reproduction. All right, so evolution by natural selection in different environments will maximize plant fitness. It's the result of these four different functions. Functions associated with survivorship, mechanics, hydraulics, and photosynthesis, and traits associated with reproduction. Now, differences in the local environment are going to select for the relative importance of these different functions. Okay. So as we move forward, we're going to try then to understand how these different functions then are selected for, traits associated then with survivorship and traits associated with reproduction. So we start getting into these major radiations of plant species and taxa. That's all going to involve elaborations of different traits associated with different functions. Photosynthesis, hydraulics, mechanics, and then these reproductive traits. Okay, so let's see here. I think what I'll do is I'm going to end it there just a little bit early because we're going to pick up on many of these themes next time. I wanted to spend then just the last few minutes with going over some of these questions. Okay? So a really good question to ask, maybe in the next quiz on the midterm exam, is I'm going to ask you what the unique selective pressures for life on land have been. Okay? What were these unique selective pressures? Okay? And so I've really emphasized over and over selection then for surviving on land and also reproducing on land. Be able then to identify the key traits associated then with survivorship and reproduction on land. It's always fun. Can you name some of these early fossil land plants? We went over a critical one today, Cooksonia, right? That was the first fossil land plant. Okay. Go forward, but kind of identify a few other ones that are really famous. Okay, life cycles. Okay, life cycles are totally boring. Oh my gosh, they will put you to sleep. Don't go to sleep. Make it easy. A life cycle is just an alternation between pignatophyte and sporophyte, haploid, diploid. That's all it is. But you should be able to know when you talk about a fern or a moss, kind of in general what those life cycles look like. Okay, and realize that the evolution by natural selection has changed the nature of the life cycle. Either the sporophyte is elaborated or the pignatophyte is elaborated. So if you compared these different life cycles, it would tell you the evolutionary history of selection for life on land. Okay. We haven't gotten to this important buildup yet, but I want to come foreshadow this. We haven't gotten to the seed plants and what a seed is. We've just talked about spores and egg and sperm. We haven't even talked about what a seed is. Oh my goodness. We talked about plant reproduction without even entering in to the spermatophytes. Worry about that yet for the seed plants. Okay. And so the story of the evolution of the seed is really cool. We haven't gotten there yet. All right.